Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and the Sentinel League has launched, and this video is going to actually be all about the new Uber bosses that I've yet to get to. I've just tested on standard. Huge spoiler warning, these are the Ubers that, are the bosses you've seen before, but with a few extra mechanics or a bit of tougher regular mechanics. So if you want to just wait till you get there yourself, which might be a while, then don't watch the video. But essentially I'm just going to go over each Uber boss that I tested on this character, which is the Armageddon brand Elementalist at the end of last league. Now let me start off by saying this character I didn't think was the best character for Ubering from last league that I had. Probably Spectral Throw, maybe Explosive Concoction. This one was probably a bit better for that, honestly. It's a good bosser, but if I was going to take a new character into some blind new sort of big fights, I think the Spectral Throw build would have been the one. Either way, this build is pretty good for bossing. It just doesn't really want to take too much big damage because the life pool is kind of mediocre, and my only real strong suit is physical damage reduction. What you're seeing in the background here is Uber Elder. So these new Uber fights, this is an Uber Elder, is these new Uber fights kind of vary from not too bad, they've just added a few mechanics, to this is kind of bullshit, I don't know what they were thinking. The Uber Elder fight in particular, I think is very reasonable. This one, even in particular, I actually Mavened. So I went ahead and tried just about every Uber fight, and it was one or two goes, and I think I killed most of them on my first shot. It's on softcore though, so of course I died several times on each kill, but within the actual fragment or attempt, I did manage to kill most of them. The ones I didn't kill were Sirus and Searing Exarch, I think, and they do have some bullshit mechanics. I'll get to that a bit later. Basically, the Uber Elder seems pretty reasonable. It's essentially the same fight. This one's even Maven, so there's a few extra mechanics because I did the one without Maven, not too bad. Essentially, he just has triple proj on his balls and also does his Shaper ball phase kinda at a few times here or there, but it's a watered down version which you can dodge if you position correctly. So most of these fights will be just a bit of a learning curve, like you're gonna have to learn to deal with the mechanics, and then once you can, they will be much more reasonable, but they are going to be largely like DPS and HP checks as well as a few little mechanic checks. Uber Elder I think is actually a pretty reasonable fight. The first one I actually tried was Uber Shaper, and it was a bit of a shock to the system just how much more chaotic things can be. So there are all three of Shapers to begin with, so a clone that does beams, a clone that does attacks, and a regular Shaper. And then on top of that, I just had to learn the hard way that there was going to be a ball phase incoming, and try and dodge that shit accordingly. There will be a certain method to doing this, I think starting out at a certain corner and just dodging the balls as they come, because they are a watered down version. There's less of them. I think they might move a bit slower, so it's reasonable to dodge them, but it is going to take a bit of practice. But I think there will be a method to it where you can do it reliably enough. Other than that, it's a pretty normal fight, just a couple extra Shapers, similar to the Maven Shaper sort of encounter. His slam's a bit bigger, his slam's a bit faster, couple extra proj, so it's nothing the Gauntlet guys wouldn't have handled. And on top of that, the balls that you pop for the ground degen, they linger throughout phases, so you do have to be careful about how you place your balls, and if you mess up, it does get worse and harder. Otherwise, I think all of these zones have something like 50 to 70% reduced damage taken by the monsters, so it does nerf your damage instead of strictly increasing HP pools. There's going to be a reduction in the damage that you deal. My character in particular actually had pretty good damage for boss fighting, so honestly, I did not notice much of a damage nerf on any of these Uber fights. It may have taken a bit longer, but it was fairly reasonable otherwise. So both Uber Elder and Shaper, pretty reasonable fights. The next one I tried was Uber Maven, and honestly, pretty reasonable fight as well. Everything's just a bit more hectic once again, so everything hits a bit harder, you got some less damage, but there's just more stuff going on at once. So the Cascade of Pain has more projectiles like LMP, a couple extra projectiles, and once you get a hang of it, you can actually dodge it methodically enough, but it does hit a bit harder. Otherwise, all of the attacks that she essentially does throughout the fight throughout the fight do happen all right from the get-go. So she can do like her extra big fireball, and that's LMP or GMP'd even. Pretty easy to dodge though. The brain phase here I don't think was really any different. The balls that you drop for the degen zones, they persist throughout the entire fight, so that's basically one of the things that can kind of get away from you most. If you mess up your arena, the rest of the fight gets quite a bit more difficult. Otherwise, she just hits a bit harder, cycles through a few more attacks, and everything, is just in need of being dodged more. So the actual like big laser sky attack thing that makes you move, if you get hit by that, you essentially die or come close to dying. And also during the memory phase, you have to fight like an extra couple of bosses, which are very reasonable. Like, they're not overtuned, they just stress you a bit to try and have to do the memory game with a bit of extra stimuli. So it might prompt you to fuck up your memory game just a bit more than you otherwise would. So otherwise, it is a pretty reasonable fight. I got it on my first shot with a couple of deaths, or 2 or 3 deaths. I ended up doing like 4 or 5 of these Mavens, maybe bricking 1 or something, and otherwise just trying to get a more deathless sort of kill happening. I'm not sure I did get a deathless kill, maybe just 1 death a few times, but it's basically the same fight, a little bit harder and a little bit more chaotic. But if you got a good character for Maven, I think that's probably one of the better ones that you could do. Both Maven and Shaper are reasonable fights for a good, well-built character. But something you definitely have to remember is these are the uber fights, and their reward ends up being pretty RNG. Like, if you get the right RNG, you spec the point, maybe you get rewarded with the right orb or piece of loot. But a lot of the time from these kills that I did, you're getting nothing still. So you're putting in all this extra work, and your character's so much better, and you are still largely being rewarded with fuck all. So you're not really missing out on much, and ultimately, if you can't do this, you could just sell the piece for maybe slightly more than you could last league, because people that can do it are going to be paying for it. And ultimately as well, it's a chase piece of content, and it's similar to, let's say, Simulacrum 30, Wave 30 for characters in the past. I knew that I'd have a few characters that can do it, but that's only as of last league. But I knew I had plenty of characters that had no shot of making it, and it doesn't really matter. It's aspirational content that's meaningless otherwise. It's just something to test your character against if you feel like you've taken on everything else to a certain degree. And then, cool, you try it out, you might win. If you win, nice, that character's slightly better than the rest of them, or maybe a real masterpiece compared to the others that you've made, but it's not a big deal if you have or haven't done it. It is just really aspirational content. Like I said, though, Maven seems largely the same. Like, the last phase is almost identical, just things hit a bit harder, just a bit more hectic in the first few phases, and a very reasonable fight otherwise. This isn't the choice of character I would have brought into all of these, but it's good enough, and Armageddon Brand has provided a decent enough playstyle that I can actually keep my damage up throughout a lot of the hectic stuff, and as such, move on through phases a bit quicker. Next fight we got is Uber Cortex, and hoo boy, can this one be a bit of an RNG doozy. So I was warned that this one might be the hardest, and I think that might just be up to RNG largely. So Cortex is going to be the same as it always has been, and that's that you get a random pile of mods from the map that are going to influence how hard it is, especially based on what character you're playing. When I popped it, and when you spec it, you are forced to take the double effectiveness of all the mods on the map. When I popped it, the things that I got were essentially just speed. So lots of extra movement, attack, cast speed, onslaught, frenzy on hit, all of that shit. And it did make clearing quite a bit sketchier, and there's also 70% less player damage, I think it is. So I didn't really want to waste any of my portals, given that I'm just trying to go fight the bosses, on much of the trash, and I just tried to speed run my way through the trash to get to the bosses. And it was a bit sketchy, but it's doable, it's pretty reasonable, and you do get a lot of loot for your troubles. The Cortexes, the bosses themselves though, end up being pretty simple. It's not really much harder than normal, it's just you deal less damage, and everything is obviously going to be a bit RNG for map mods and all that, but you have to fight 2 of them at once. So having to dodge like double mechanics from these Cortex bosses, especially with some of these map mods, and in my case lots and lots of extra attack speed and cast speed, meant that it's pretty fucking impossible to dodge some of this, and you have to be able to prepare to take hits. But otherwise, Armageddon brand, there's 4 brands that I can put up, or 5 brands, but 2 on each enemy, meaning I have maximum uptime on both enemies, and that really just means that I'm actually pretty capable at doing this Cortex thing, and it really wasn't that bad in the end. I managed to have like 1 or 2 deaths, I think, but otherwise Uber Cortex was manageable, and I think it's just going to be largely RNG as to what type of map mods you get. Like if I for example had a bunch of resists and maybe more area on the screen, that would have possibly been harder, but at the same time I think lots of extra attack and cast speed is already one of the hardest things you can get, and it seemed not too bad. But it does also kind of highlight how much worse it would be as like a melee and a strike character, because you have to be up in the faces of all these enemies and attacking while they're firing off all these fucking attacks. Whereas what I was doing, dropping a couple of brands and just running away and hoping they die. And a lot of the time, yeah, they ended up dying. So not too crazy and somewhat reasonable, but you know, it obviously can just be a bit bullshit, and there's not much you can do about it. Maybe just have to open another one, because bad luck. That one was not good enough for your character. As well as that, I accidentally left Maven influence on this Cortex, and it didn't add too much. It was just a bit of extra Maven influence. So a bit harder than it should have been, but still pretty reasonable. So I'd say those fights were all not too bad, but these next 3 are where I think it gets quite a bit more bullshit, and that's starting with Sirus. Now, of course, we've all had issues with Sirus in the past, but what this was kind of caught me off guard, and it was a little bit of a surprise. Essentially, the Sirus is plenty of what the old Sirus you remember, being like bugged and bullshit and kind of dumb mechanics, all merged into one, and also harder and worse. Now, it caught me pretty off guard because, to begin with, during his rotation of like actual stuff you fight him on, he does just put up a storm in the middle, and that one starts knocking you back, so it like interrupts your entire flow of gameplay. But it's just an extra mechanic, and you can honestly play around it. It's not too bad. And the entire first 3 phases of Sirus are, you know, once you actually understand what's happening, somewhat reasonable. It's the last phase that things start to get way too hectic and a bit dumb. As well as that, all of his attacks, his just auto attacks, have a much fatter beam, so it is a bit harder to dodge those, but most characters that are going to be at the level of like crushing endgame content are built well enough to like practically face tank Sirus and not care about his auto attacks or even his die beam. So I don't think that's going to be too bad. Even my character that is kind of squish against that shit could handle taking those hits. But the last phase is just all kinds of bullshit. So he starts out by dropping all these degen puddles all over the ground before you even get to do anything. And they do disable your regen, and that kind of fucks my RF character. And then they persist just throughout everything. So throughout the mazes that you're doing, there's these degen puddles that you have to like run over. Throughout the other mechanics, he's just going to chuck you into a tunnel, and there's going to be a degen puddle in there, and the tunnel shit hits harder. On top of that, his big quad beam thing that he does, there's just more beams, and then he'll just like fly off the screen a bit more randomly, and you won't really be able to see him, and then he'll do a fat die beam and you can't really catch up to it, and it's fatter, and then you just die to it. I mean, I think it is still a bit of a learning curve. It's going to be a bit more about the last phase, like getting used to it, and if you die, you really set yourself back big time, like for softcore shit is what we're talking here. You do set yourself back big time, because re-entering a Sirus fight is pretty tough, and then reacquainting yourself with the new situation is honestly kind of so much worse than having to just keep going. On top of that, I feel like flasks were pretty clutch in letting me survive certain things, and then once you start running out of flasks, all of a sudden you are getting shit on. But it's mostly just the start of the new phase where he just drops a bunch of these degen circles. It kind of just becomes super chaotic, because you've got so many less areas that you can run and dodge things, and you lose a lot of your control that you previously had, and those degen circles are just ridiculous, especially for my character that's trying to use RF, but even without it, it was quite a bit much, and ultimately I don't know if I even actually killed a Sirus. I had a couple attempts, and on the second attempt, I got deathless right to the last phase. I got him down to like 30% deathless, and it was going well. And then I died once, and then re-entering the fight is so hard, and there's so much shit going on, I just end up chain dying. So I really actually did not quite enjoy this one, the Sirus fight, and compared to the Maven and the Uber Elder and Cortex and all that, it seemed like, you know, the same boss with a bit of extra. This one felt like the same boss with just a whole bunch of bullshit. So yeah, wasn't a big fan of that one. Next fight I did was, I actually only gave one shot, and that is the Searing Exarch, and it is basically the same fight, but it is somewhat amplified in kind of the wrong ways. I don't know, it did feel pretty bullshit. That was the first time I came across the Annihilation attack, so it was just like 5 times bigger than normal, and I think it is dodgeable, and I did try and do that a few times, and it's manageable, but as the fight progresses, it gets so much worse. So you need to be able to just like run around him in circles, and that's doable. But if you get caught out, you just die. Otherwise, the ball phase is a bit more hectic. There is an enemy you've got to attack, and it persists, so if you don't kill it, it just stays up throughout the phases. It's not too bad, but honestly the issue with this fight is the Annihilation attack combined with the fact that those circles that he puts down the ground, which I think degen you and also remove some fire resist, maybe something like that, those just keep filling up the screen, and you know, it's kind of just a huge DPS check. If you don't blow them up in like a phase or two, then your entire screen's going to be covered in those, and you really can't dodge things anymore and move around anymore too freely. And I wasn't a huge fan of the fight either. It felt like an amplified version of bullshit of the fight, as opposed to some reasonable, you know, chaining some extra attacks or something. Largely though, you can as softcore cheese this shit, because you can see that every time I re-enter, if there's like a ball phase, I can just AFK for a minute and let him go through the ball phase, and then we've ignored that, and it can end up just on softcore being a DPS check where you just come in, do as much damage as possible, almost kill him, come back in after dying, and then he'll die. So it's a bit lame that this fight, for me, honestly feels like it is just going to be a DPS check. Because otherwise it doesn't feel super well thought out or too clean as far as a boss or a bunch of mechanics you can outplay. You just need to have the right amount of DPS, and otherwise maybe log out if you're put into some compromising circumstances. But you can see where in the end there's just too much degen ground, whatever the fuck you'd call it. It becomes pretty unreasonable, and there's not a lot you can do in the end. I can't dodge anything, and it's just over. Otherwise, I do think, yeah, the ball phase is still pretty manageable. It kind of sucks that golems and other things are going to pop them, but I'm pretty sure if it works the same way as it used to, you can still cheese it kind of just by putting totems down and blockading anything that's coming towards you, and as such, not really having to dodge much. I wasn't a fan. I only tried this one time, and I'm pretty sure I could have zerged down a bit harder and after learning the mechanics a bit better, but this one really didn't feel like that much more fun than before, though I guess kind of reasonable in what it was. Just a DPS check, wasn't that much more fun. And then lastly, Eater of Worlds, which really didn't enjoy either. They basically amplified a lot of his mechanics to the point where I don't think just about anyone could tank them. Everything's like fucking one-shotting you, and it's so much faster. On top of that, I think that first death is kind of just like a cheap shot, like they made him just spawn a bit quicker and just attack you instantly, whereas before, you had a small window, so it felt like a cheap shot, but maybe I'm wrong. Otherwise, I did have like 5 goes at this, because I had a few sets that bought from someone, and after learning it a bit, I did kill him I think 2 or 3 times out of those 5 sets, but it was a bit of a learning curve as to the mechanics, and those mechanics were pretty unforgiving. And on top of that, the actual drown phase, when you're supposed to like go with Maven and help pop those bubbles, that felt extremely unforgiving and bullshit. So a lot of this, yeah, you just kind of have to stay away from him. Like, I don't know how Melee's going to fucking do this, but his big explosion thing is pretty big and you have to go away from it, and he could do 2 of those in a row. His beam attack is super fast and you really have to be on point with the dodge on that, but I do think it is dodgeable. I'm not sure if it's going to be too reliably dodgeable, because if you miss the timing by just a little bit, you're kind of fucked. You almost essentially have to be directly on top of him to never miss that timing and just run around him. But then the drowning phase, I'm really not sure what the fuck's happening there. I've got a lot of regen on this character, some good fizz reduction, and I'm dying super quick to those degens that he's doing, and as well as that, the balls that promote you to drown move so much faster, and he's got extra slaps that happen during the phase, like just melee attacks or some shit, tentacles that hit extremely hard. And this fight to me was absolutely no fun at all. So not really sure what they were going for with it. Everything's just like amped up super big, and I think it's just another DPS check. Like, you can kind of blow them up quickly, and you can then maybe tank some of this shit, but I don't know how you're going to really manage that with a character that's tanky, and then you're going to have to do like 15 phases and play it perfectly. Otherwise, what else can I say about it? The 2 times I killed it, it dropped nothing. So it was just the bow and nothing else, because there's the reward for it, you know, potentially getting some cool shit like the new Ascendancy jewels, and 25% chance for an exceptional like Eldritch thing. I didn't get any of that, so I killed him 2 or 3 times, I think it was, and just got nothing for it, which felt pretty bad. But ultimately it did feel kind of like a DPS check and a little bit of a mechanic check, but I'm really not sure how you're going to reliably survive those drowning phases, because the balls can be RNG, like Maven, or the balls that you're supposed to use for Maven can all just get clustered up together, which happened once or twice, and once they're all clustered up together, you can't pop them because he's just constantly beaming down on top of you, and then there's like some tentacles and shit happening, and I don't know what the fuck this fight wants from me. I honestly did not enjoy this one bit. So in conclusion, I do think the Ubers are there for you to do if you really want to test your character to the next level, and some of them are going to be kind of fun, some are going to be probably rewarding enough, and some of them, I don't know, maybe you do just to test your character, fucking hate it, maybe win, and then never do it again. Who knows? Who knows? Either way, there is new aspirational content, just in case you want it. Probably treat it the same as a Simulacrum 30, you know. Your character's so good that it can take on all content pretty comfortably. Try it against some harder shit. See how it feels. But a few of these fights just feel pretty fucking bullshit, and it just kind of solidifies that some of the old fights like Shaper and Elder are still some of the best, most well-designed fights in PoE, and some fights, who the fuck knows. So in any case, hope you guys enjoyed the video and the showcase of all of the new Uber bosses. I do think I could have had a better character for it, but this one was honestly pretty reasonable, and it was a good enough test. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.